Division at the COP30 Climate Change Summit in Brazil. A more difficult message to tell to the world than progress. Scientists, politicians, media and business all have a huge role to play in keeping the public engaged. Are they succeeding? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. The COP30 Climate Summit in Brazil has been marked by disagreement, not the message those warning about climate change would like to emerge. The topic is as complex as it is divisive, so keeping the public engaged is no easy task. Years of dire warnings can risk public fatigue, while the many scientific issues involved are difficult to sell in the age of short sound bites and social media snippets. Scientists, experts in their field, may have little skill in public relations or journalism, and media, skilled in news and politics, for example, may not have the same expertise in science, which is, as you know, at the heart of the climate change debate. Then there are corporate interests and lobbyists competing with their point of view. So how are people around the world engaging with the climate debate? What's the risk of them switching off? And just how important is public engagement? Who's winning the battle? We'll put that to our guests shortly. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
The climate crisis is worsening. It's leading to more extreme weather, with the hottest summers on record causing fires and drought, and with devastating floods and catastrophic storms becoming more common. This is despite 3 decades of COP, the annual UN Climate Summit, and a decade of the Paris Agreement, the Global Climate Treaty. The first COP summit was in Berlin in 1995, before the Paris Agreement and the push to cut emissions. The Paris Agreement of 10 years ago set a target limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with 2 degrees the absolute extreme. It also aimed to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the mid-century and provide economic support to countries vulnerable to climate change. But this isn't happening on a scale that will prove impactful.
The presidency has described COP30 as the moment of truth. For us as species, that truth is that we are seeing the 1.5 target disappear before our eyes.
In fact, 2 degrees Celsius is no longer possible, as many countries miss targets and emissions have been rising to a record high, and aid to vulnerable countries has not been sufficient. Critics of COP30 say the lack of a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels in the Paris Agreement has posed a challenge for this summit a decade later.
How are we going to come out from this COP to say and to tell the people that we deny the most basic scientific truth, which is that the fossil fuels are the cause of more than 80% of the emissions that are generating climate change?
Others argue that the world was on course to a 4 degrees Celsius rise, so anything less is an achievement. But as the environment deteriorates and people's suffering increases, immediate change is urgent. So how to reach an agreement and achieve it is one challenge, and how to keep the public engaged and informed is another. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guest now. In the Brazilian city of Belém, Professor John Sweeney, one of Ireland's foremost climate scientists and contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's Nobel Peace Prize-winning assessment report. In London, Professor Allam Ahmed, a leading scholar in sustainable development and the knowledge economy. And in Washington, D.C., Michael Shank, a climate communication expert and a former director of media strategy at Climate Nexus. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Welcome to Inside Story. I wonder if I could start with you, John, soon as you are at the summit there in Belém. This year's COP, as we know, has gone into extra time, and delegates, from what we understand, have been locked in a bitter fight on the final wording of any kind of report, even whether that should include the phrase fossil fuels or the word roadmap. I mean, John, can you explain exactly what the nearly 200 nations at the conference have been trying to agree on through all of this?
Well, they are trying to agree on a roadmap effectively for the sustainable future of the planet. And that is proving extremely difficult. We know this is the 30th attempt to do so. And each time, while the majority of the world's countries are agreed on the substantive things that must be included in an agreement and how to implement that agreement, which is the primary task of this COP, there are a number of countries who do not see the need to include the word fossil fuels in any final agreement. And this is quite a roadblock, really, because unless you actually tackle the root cause of all of these climate problems, then I think we're going to fail to take the necessary steps to preserve any kind of semblance of staying below 1.5 or even 2 degrees. And I think you're right in the sense that the public have, to some extent, switched off in the past year or two on this issue. I mean, the media has been dominated by geopolitical events which tug at our heartstrings. Gaza, Ukraine, the Sudan. These effectively tug at our heartstrings in a way that, if you like, long duration events like floods or droughts don't. And as a result, people become very much motivated by the short term. They believe they are powerless as well in the face of what they see, for example, happening here in Belém over the past 2 weeks or so. And I think the other aspect that's important to mention here is that society has a collective amnesia about extreme events. We know 16,000 people died, for example, in Europe this year from excess heat. But how many people on the street remember that now? How many people remember the tragedies of Jamaica and the Philippines now, even in the past 2 weeks? Because we are so attuned to looking at the short term, we don't really get to grips with the necessary changes in our lifestyle to protect the generations that come after us. And of course, all of this is, if you like, fuel for those who don't want to look in the long term.
OK, John, many thanks for setting the scene for us. Michael, if I could turn to you, because I understand that 36 countries, including wealthy nations, emerging economies and small island states, have warned in a letter to Brazil that they would reject any deal that did not include a plan to move away from oil, coal and gas. That language is reportedly being blocked by oil-rich Russia and Saudi Arabia, along with coal producer India and, quote, many emerging countries. I mean, what's at the crux of this divide, Michael?
Well, this year we're seeing a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists attend the climate talks, COP30. I've been involved in many of the talks historically, and we see a rising number of fossil fuel lobbyists, fossil fuel industry attend these climate talks, which is why Colombia and Netherlands have agreed in April to host in Colombia the first international conference focused on a phase out of fossil fuels, because many are seeing the climate talks in COP as ineffective and unable to build the kind of consensus, even around, as you noted, Neave, a roadmap in phasing out fossil fuels. So if COP isn't able to bring together this consensus, we're seeing a whole nother track of conversation internationally to build that kind of consensus among willing nations.
Allam, turning to you, because delegates from emerging economies have hit back at the talks by the sounds of it, angry that they're being in some way portrayed as less caring about the welfare of the planet. They say they acknowledge, of course, the urgency of climate change, but insist on something called a just transition. What does just transition mean, Allam?
Thank you very much. I think just to add a few points to my colleagues earlier is that I think the big problem we are facing here is that the disconnect between governments and their citizens, and that is growing bigger. Awareness is growing bigger, so the gap is getting bigger in terms of this conflict. Many countries across the developing countries, I meet prime ministers, I meet ministers, I meet very senior people in academia and others. And all of them, you can see, they agree to the fact this is not our making. In developing countries, for example, they will say, this is not our making. Just take Pakistan a few years ago. And the minister came here to London and she said, this is nothing to do with us as a Pakistani government or government of Pakistan. But at the same time, the people who are causing this, like China, United States, and so on, they should really be responsible of helping us out. Because we're living in one planet, and the United Nations is supposed to bring all these countries together. But frankly, from my very close relationship with the United Nations agencies, is failing in doing exactly that. So as the member countries, this is continuously, and I just remember one of our colleagues, one of our founding member, Dr. Gail Rigobert, at that time, she was the Minister for Sustainable Development for South Asia. She, in the Paris COP, she said bluntly like this, in 50 years, that was 10 years ago, so it's 40 years left now, she said in 50 years, countries in the Caribbean like South Lucia, they will not just be affected by flooding or by global warming or climate change, they will disappear. She said that bluntly like this in Paris, they will disappear. Imagine a minister of sustainable development telling you, my country will disappear, there will be no South Lucia, no Caribbean island. So despite that, countries who are causing a lot of this problem, like the United States, are not just not taking their responsibility, but they are, even now, the United States is out of the talks. United States, for example, is not even submitting a report to the United Nations about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, we call it voluntary national review. And yet, the problem is the United Nations, because you should hold these countries accountable. Just to add here one point, the classic conflict between China and the US, for example, the Chinese, one of the biggest polluters of this world, if they want it or they didn't mean it, they keep arguing that for the Americans, we want to grow and to become a leading nation worldwide the same way you did many years ago. So we are using the same ladder to climb and to become a global leader. So we're not going to stop what we are doing.
John, I wonder if you can pause there, because I want to put the same question to John. John, how would you describe a just transition? Because I understand that an earlier rejected draft called for a manifold increase in financial support for developing countries. It also called for, quote, efforts to triple adaptation finance by 2030 compared to 2025 levels. Why this apparent pushback by rich countries when it comes to helping poorer countries move away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, a just transition is when you don't leave somebody behind. And we're certainly doing that. Your previous speaker really emphasized the tragic situation of the small island developing states, where we are in the developed north effectively obliterating a culture, effectively obliterating a nation. And I think it brings to mind not just the scientific issue, which, you know, we've become very familiar with over the past 30 years, is not getting through to the decision makers in the public. And that's why I think it's very important that we start looking at the morality and we start looking at the ethics of what we're doing to those nations of the global south. Because in a way, after many years, I'm coming to the conclusion that science and scientific thought appeals to our brains, but really what we should be appealing to in these matters is also our heart. Okay. And I think there is a strong argument for doing that now.
OK, well, let me put that to Michael, because in addition to the lines that have been coming out of COP30, we understand, and this is coming from the Reuters news agency, Michael, that the Arab group negotiating bloc, whose 22 members include Saudi Arabia and the UAE, told a closed-door meeting of negotiators that its energy industries were, quote, off limits in discussions, with Saudi Arabia warning that targeting its industries would potentially collapse negotiations. What do you make of that, Michael?
Well, I think the market will ultimately win this argument. We're seeing globally that all new power capacity, 90% of all new power capacity is renewable. Solar is now the cheapest electricity in history, and renewables will account for over $2 trillion of investment this year, which doubles fossil fuels. So while COP negotiators from countries, certainly in Gulf states and the US being absent, will continue to double down on fossil fuels. What we're seeing in the market is the rising tide of renewables. And they, at the end of the day, in the market, will win the hearts and minds. I do think, and I appreciate that Al Jazeera is focusing on this, how to build the political will, the public will, and the private sector will for this transition is the work ahead. And perhaps too much time has been spent on doubling down on what are the problems, what are the solutions. When I teach at NYU, my grad students, I tell them we know what the problems and solutions are in the climate space. The work ahead for us is building the public will, the private sector will, and the political will for this work, which is why I'm thrilled that Al Jazeera is focusing on this today.
Gentlemen, I wonder if we can talk about the messaging when it comes to the climate crisis. I mean, I've been a journalist for a while. I've reported on shrinking glaciers in the Himalayas. I've tracked polar bears, emaciated polar bears in the Arctic. There seems to be a fundamental problem in the way in which the climate crisis is communicated. We've all done it, either through this doomsday visual sequence of sort of crumbling ice sheets, of ghostly coral reefs, of surging seas. You know the drill. You know what it looks like, don't you? Or the alternative are these dry, unrelatable numbers about temperature increases. I mean, how can the crisis be communicated clearly and honestly in a way that truly represents the urgency of the situation, while at the same time, Michael, this is to you because you're the expert I know in this field, in the same time empowering governments and populations in the process?
What I tell my cities and counties around the world that I consult and have consulted for the last 10 years is be more human. And by that, I mean, think like a human, talk like a human, and show more humans. In the thinking like a human, we know what polls with most majorities and most publics. It's usually cost of living, it's usually unaffordable housing, unaffordable healthcare, immigration, national security. And that's why the authoritarian rise in parts of Europe, certainly in the United States, have tapped into those household concerns, what people are prioritizing. Climate ranks poorly in relationship to those priorities. So how do we reorient the climate work within housing, healthcare, jobs? We definitely can. In talking more like a human, we need to stop using deep decarbonization and net zero and carbon neutrality and embodied carbon, because the publics aren't using that language. And then in showing more humans, how do we show real people right now that are reeling from climate impacts or are improved by climate solutions? Too much of the climate space is data, facts, figures, 2030, 2040, 2050. We really need to make it real for folks right now in our communities.
Allam, turning to you, do you think the climate crisis has slipped down the news agenda, as suggested by the other panellists? Are we now more focused on political instability and conflict without potentially realising that climate change, especially dwindling natural resources, especially water, may actually fuel conflict in the not-too-distant future, Allam?
I think I'm slightly different. My view is different here, because looking at the statistics and examining social media, examining news like Jazeera and others, I think it actually is opposite. There's a lot of news, there's a lot of coverage. Just compare Copenhagen 2009, compare it to Dubai, for example, 2023. The stories at that time, there were only 24,000 stories about climate change and so on. In Dubai 2 years ago, is 150,000 or something. So the numbers are huge. In terms of the general public awareness, just look at the program we are just now. I mean, a lot of information. And more interestingly, the public are so much becoming interested in climate change. There's a lot of surveys done by respected organizations across the whole globe, in the UK, in the US and others. And all of them, they said that the public are so much worry and concern about climate change, and maybe 71% of them, that's quite a big number, are really engaging, are really frustrated with the way their governments are not doing enough. Interestingly, some of the surveys I came across, even governments, they think 30% of them only think they are doing enough towards doing something good for climate change. So I think that's a fact. The other thing is, we have seen this across the whole world. At universities, students are become so much, we call them these generations, they are so sustainability oriented, so very much focused on climate change. So the awareness, in my opinion, is very high. The media has done fantastic work. I really, those all the work done, like Jazeera, BBC, Sky, all of them, they have done fantastic work bringing this to the floor. I think the big problem we are facing, because of the more media coverage and the more media reports about this issue, Pakistan and so on, and that created a more bigger gap with governments which are not really responding to the needs of the people. Look to the issues when the fight at Columbia University, students going to the street for Palestine, here in London, and so on. And I think the last point mentioned by Michael is very important point. I think that's one of the cause problems. We are losing our humanity. We need to be more humane, like Michael just said. But Understood. If you look to the amount of deaths happening in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and where is the world? It is not. This is the heart of humanity. If we are the United Nations countries, we don't feel about the deaths in these three countries, just these three countries. What about the climate change? So that's the problem, I think. The media coverage is fantastic, well done. But I think the problem is governments are...
Allam, let me put all of that to John. John has sort of suggested that there seems to be a gap between the public and obviously the policymakers, that the public are perhaps more informed than they ever have been before, but they hit a wall when it comes to being able to actually affect change.
I think Michael's point is very good, but to add to it, I think we as climate scientists have to accept some responsibility for our failure to communicate. And I think that the point about university education is also very valid in that if you think about what the career advancement of a young climate scientist involves, it involves writing papers, going to conferences, getting your citation index up. There is no reward for communicating with the public. There is no reward for getting across the essentials of climate change to the public in a human way, as Michael was describing. And I think that's an issue that we have to tackle in the education system as well. To go back to climate science, it's not a complicated issue to communicate. At the end of the day, as I sit here in Belém, if I put an overcoat on, I get a lot warmer. And that's essentially what we've done to the planet. And that's the basic idea, that we have to communicate in simple expressions to the general public. Okay. The problem is that scientists are not good at that because they're not brought up in the kind of debating society that social scientists are. And that's part of the reason why they can't get the message across that facts alone do not deliver the goods.
Of course, Tony, Michael, I mean, there's a whole industry, the lobbying industry, lobbying firms that make a huge amount of money to skew the discussion either one way or the other. I mean, I wonder what they do to our consensus on climate change. I mean, after all, this year is taking place without the United States present. Donald Trump shunned the event. I mean, what impact do you think, Michael, the lobbyists are actually having on our full understanding of what's going on as regards to the climate crisis?
Lobby has had a huge impact. In the United States, the fossil fuel industry has lobbied Congress. I used to work in Congress, so I've seen this lobby in effect, but they've been lobbying with hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign finance year after year after year after year after year. That's not new, though we did see a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists in COP30 in Brazil. Clearly, they're ramping up pressure there, but the lobby has always been there. I do think that we need to do differently in communication, which we're already talking about here. But one other thing I want to add, given the lack of agency most people feel when it comes to taking action on climate, you know, if I switch to solar or get an EV, an electric vehicle, or switch to a heat pump or weatherize my house and pursue energy efficiency, will that shift the needle? Will that move the needle on climate change? A lot of people feel like it won't. So what cities and counties, local governments are doing that's different, which we applaud and we support at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, where I consult, is really putting the power in the people so that they're deciding, they're discerning the future of climate policy, sustainability policy in the city. So you're seeing cities like Amsterdam, Glasgow, turn to citizen assemblies to discern their climate future. And that really puts the agency and authority in the people's hands so that they feel like they have more direction over the local government's climate future and sustainability future.
So one way, you suggest, Michael, that's being employed already of combating this information war that seems to be at the heart of climate discussions is to localise the debate. An interesting point. Allam, I mean, I want to ask you also about the messaging that's coming out of the energy industry as well, because earlier this year, British Petroleum announced it was slashing more than $5 billion in planned green energy investments. It said it was shifting to focusing on growing long-term shareholder value, with more being invested in oil and gas. I mean, BP isn't the only giant rolling back on its messaging. Shell and Norway state-controlled Equinor have also done the same. Why is this happening, Allam? And what kind of message does it send to consumers and governments if the big companies are taking steps backwards?
Very, very good question. Back in 2018, we joined the United Nations in Geneva for a major conference on public-private partnership for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. The UN believes strongly on the role of the private sector. I believe, and I think many people believe. But the problems like this. One, these projects are very expensive. Very, very expensive. Any rollback of all these transformation projects towards green, let's call them all these green initiatives, are very expensive. But they need support from the government. If you look back in our country here, Rishi Sunak, at the time he was a prime minister, he rolled back from the commitment of the government to have electric car by 2030 to further, because he said, let's be realistic. It is very expensive for the consumer now. It's very expensive in Europe and in the UK, for example. So what if that message is sending to the private sector? I am the government. I'm rolling back from my commitment to the people who voted for me to have electric car by 2030 or 2040. So what is the message you're sending to private sector? Okay, it's okay for you to reduce, to stop, to do any transformation initiative. That's number one. Number two, I think that is also critical. These companies, they are facing, in my opinion, a long-term research and development plan. They didn't plan for the increase of the population. They didn't plan well for the increase of the needs of climate change. They were not so much informed many years ago to predict the future for their investment. And now they are faced with quite a large bill. You're talking about trillions of pounds or dollars in order to put their books in order. So they don't know what to do, where to go.
Right.
Finally, in the energy statements coming from, like the statement you said, this just came out from the Gulf. I think that's an issue need to be addressed slightly separately, because we all know
Allam, thanks for that. Allam, we're just reaching the end of the programme. I want to put one last brief question to you, John, if I may, because the overall message that I'm hearing from all three of you, that it's quite easy to get bogged down in the details and feel overwhelmed and powerless. I wonder what your final words, John, would be. What's your message to the sizable majority of people who feel that they just don't know how to navigate all of this, but are urgently wanting to do something? John, over to you.
Well, I think the urgent message is get involved, firstly. See where the fake news is coming from. Judge your media very, very carefully indeed as it begins to fall into a smaller and smaller group of very wealthy individuals who may well have a chilling effect on editors and people who put out the news. But the bottom line, I think, is just see what you can do for your local community, think locally, but then have awareness of what your impact will be on a global scale, and get involved in trying to move the dial higher up the system at political level, if at all possible. Express your views first and foremost.
OK, well, we have reached the end of our discussion. It flew by. It's been an absolute joy and incredibly illuminating to speak to all three of you. John Sweeney, Allam Ahmed and Michael Shank. A pleasure to have you on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Neave Barker, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.